Muy buenas tardes a todos los que están aquí presentes. Doy la bienvenida a la última jornada de esta Conferencia Internacional de Desarrollo y Cohesión Social.
International Conference of Development and International Cohesion that we have done together with
Desarrollo Social. Dejo con ustedes al director del Núcleo Milenio, el profesor Abigail Wozniak.
Well, hello, thank you for coming to all. We have a great guest today, so I'm going to tell you about her a little bit. Professor Abigail Wozniak is a labor economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, where she serves as director of the Opportunity and Inclusive Growth Institute. She graduated from Harvard University, where she got a PhD in economics. She's a former
Hola. Hola.
She serves as a senior economist to the White House Council of Economic Advisors under the President Barack Obama. She was associate professor in the Department of Economics at the University of Notredame. Her research has examined migration between states and cities, as well as employer compensation and screening policy, among other studies. Professor Wozniak is currently a faculty research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research and a research fellow at the Institute for the Study of Labor. She also serves as co-editor of the journal Economic Inquirer. She's going to present a work related with the pandemic and its effect on different variables, in particular on mental health. So thank you so much, Professor Wozniak, for being here. And you can start the presentation. At the end, we are going to have a few minutes to ask you some questions. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Fabian. And thank you for having me. And thank you, everyone, for listening. Even if you're trying to listen in translation a bit, I hope that you'll find this interesting, and we will have plenty of time for questions. So I encourage you to speak up if there's something that wasn't clear or places where you'd like more detail, or other questions are welcome as well. I do want to highlight that the views I'm going to express here are mine and do not necessarily represent those of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis or the Federal Reserve System. Whenever any of us involved in research are out talking about our work, that's just a routine disclaimer that we give so folks understand where we're coming from. And what I'm going to try to do in this talk is really three things. So the first is to tell you a bit about the Opportunity and Inclusive Growth Institute that I direct. I think there was interest in that from the organizers about hearing a bit more about that. The second thing is to tell you what we have done at the Opportunity and Inclusive Growth Institute, or OIGI, in 2020, in particular to respond around the pandemic. And then the third thing I'm going to try to do is to reflect on our work a little bit, and in particular to reflect on the survey work we've been doing and the value of that overall in the pandemic landscape, because I think there are potentially general lessons there for governments and agencies interested in doing this going forward. So let me tell you first a bit more about the Institute so you understand more where I'm coming from. And so this is really, I think, fairly unique in central banks throughout the world. We are a research institute within the Federal Reserve System, and in particular, we're housed at the Minneapolis Federal Reserve. So for those of you who are less familiar with how that system works in the US, every reserve bank, and there are 12 of them that contribute to the Federal Reserve System, has its own economic research department that functions a lot like an academic research department. But for a lot of reasons, those departments have tended to reflect what I would call fairly traditional central banking topics. So folks working on exchange rates and folks working on monetary policy and very classical macro topics. Those are all folks that you would find in reserve bank research departments in large numbers. And you would find folks working on other sets of questions that also relate to how the economy is working. But if folks are looking at, say, a kind of broader set of questions that fall outside of that traditional central banking set of topics, they often were kind of fewer in number in those research departments. And so the OIGI was really formed in large part to support research that would help increase opportunity and inclusive growth throughout the US economy, because that is in support of the Federal Reserve's maximum employment mandate. So our job is really to think about how the economy is functioning for the full distribution of workers and individuals and households in order to better understand whether we're meeting that maximum employment mandate. But part of the way that we do that really is twofold. I kind of describe the tools that we use to achieve that mission as coming in one of two varieties. So the first is to really grow the connections that the Federal Reserve has to research in the Institute's mission areas. So for us, this means really expanding that set of topics that the Federal Reserve research apparatus can connect to. And we do that, I'll tell you a bit more about this in the next slide, in part by bringing in visitors, but also in part by just really working to support, I think, different types of research than you have found typically in large amounts, at least in Reserve Bank research departments. So that first piece is really just grow connections to a broader set of frontier style research and researchers that can inform how we understand how the economy is working for everyone. Really importantly, this means for us also reaching outside of economics. And so the Institute does have a real goal of connecting with research beyond economists, because we think there's a lot of expertise out there and a lot of cutting edge research about how households engage with the economy and how our institutions that provide for folks structure and themselves and function. And we can learn a lot from other disciplines about how those pieces work and therefore how they contribute to the economy. So really starting to reach outside of economics for expertise is another real emphasis at the Institute. And you can see that, for example, in our advisory board, which has representatives from economics, but also from sociology, political science, criminal science, and we're working to run that even further. So really growing that research tent that we have connections to as a central bank is a key part of the Institute's work. And then the second piece of our work is to share the results of this research that we connect with more widely, and in particular, to make its implications for policymakers more transparent. And the reason that's important is because we hope to inform policy that will expand opportunity and inclusive growth in the US economy, because that supports the Federal Reserve's mandate. But often the way that policymakers can take up this research means that it needs to go outside the Federal Reserve system to be effective. So just really simply, if we have work, for example, one of our new economists has work on legal aid programs and how interacting with legal aid programs affects longer run outcomes for folks who were able to get that assistance. Those are not programs that the Federal Reserve administers itself. That's a different part of the US policymaking apparatus. But we have the ability to do and connect with cutting edge research on that topic. And so sharing what we find in terms of implications is really important for making that effective for policymaking and creating an effective evidence base for that policy. So just, I gave you kind of brief examples. Here's a longer list of specifically how we engage in these two broad strategies for meeting our mission. For one thing, we have our own research economists, but we also bring in a huge number of visiting scholars compared to our overall staff. We're typically bringing in between 15 and 20 visiting scholars a year for visits up to a 9-month period or as short as 2 weeks. And I've highlighted this because our application portal is going to open on December 1st, and I hope folks who are interested will take a look and think about applying to be a visiting scholar. We also engage with a broad group of economists in a variety of areas and really broader researchers as well. As I mentioned with our advisory board, we engage throughout the system with affiliated economists in all the reserve banks who then connect with us. And we offer scholarly conferences and working paper series. Part of our sharing the results and implications of research, we have a number of ways in which we do that. I've highlighted because I hope you'll try to connect with them as well. We offer policy audience conferences. These are a little bit distinct from the scholarly conferences, which might also be of interest to folks here. I kind of put the scholarly conferences under our research bucket, and I put the policy conferences under our more communications bucket. But both of them are easy to connect with. A great advantage of Federal Reserve conferences is that they're all always free, and Zoom has allowed us to expand our offerings even more. So I hope you'll watch for those conferences and see if there are things that are of interest. We also have a magazine that summarizes all of the things happening at the Institute, which is also free. So feel free to check that out on our website. And that will just give you a better sense, I think, of how the Institute is now working to share out what we connect with in the way of research. And we're working to build that out even more. So this makes us, again, I think, somewhat unique within the Federal Reserve System, is that we are organized around a particular set of topics rather than a region. And we're working to really push information out into the broader policy world beyond the confines of the Federal Reserve itself. So again, I hope that just gives you a brief overview of how we work as an institute, and I'm going to spend the rest of the talk really telling you more about what we've done around COVID-19 in particular. So the Federal Reserve, of course, has a lot of folks who engage in modeling the economy, and the Institute is bringing something somewhat different to the research apparatus that the Fed can connect with. And so around COVID-19, and I'm going to tell you a bit more about how the Institute and I got involved with this, there really was space for the Institute to try to say, well, what is it that we could bring that would be different or complementary to what the Federal Reserve is already collecting and analyzing in terms of COVID-19's impact on the US economy. And so our work really has fallen over the last several months into, I would say, two broad headings. The first is, and I actually put this second on the slide, I think as you might imagine, we have a lot of visiting scholars, we support scholars in various ways, and so we've been able to support scholars who are working on COVID-19 relevant work. I'm going to share summaries, just brief highlights of that with you towards the end of the presentation. What I've been spending a lot of time on is a second piece, which is really advocating for a particular type of data collection and analysis in the overall policy conversation around COVID-19. And specifically, I've been advocating for the development of high quality, real-time survey sources that themselves can be tailored to broad policy decisions that need to be made in the pandemic. So let me explain a bit more about why a survey, for one thing, and then in particular, what kind of survey. So why are surveys potentially important around COVID-19? Now, this might actually sound like kind of a ridiculous question. Of course, surveys are important. We have lots happening. One of the main ways in general we find out what's happening with a population is to survey them. Of course, we need surveys. But what we've seen in COVID-19 is really a deep, I would say, explosion of interest in big data sources, and then also to some extent in administrative data sources, both of which I think are extremely valuable. And in no way am I suggesting that we shouldn't be using these additional sources of input into kind of how the economy is faring. But I think it's important to keep sight of what surveys offer policymakers that is different from these kinds of ancillary or found data or administrative data. And in particular, I think surveys have three really big advantages that are important to keep in that information space when you're trying to gather real-time information on something as complex as how the pandemic environment is unfolding. So the first advantage is that a survey can always be tailored to decision maker questions. And this could be a plus and a minus, right? You don't necessarily want policymakers coming in every other week and changing up survey questions on an instrument that we hope to guide us through the entirety of the pandemic. But on the other hand, if there are questions, for example, that we would like to answer around where people are going and how much time they're spending there and why they're choosing to leave their house versus stay home, Some of those questions we can answer, for example, with the cell phone data that has become very popular in this space, but some of those questions we can't answer. So what really informs a person's decision to leave their house and spend time in a restaurant right now versus not do that, versus doing takeout? Well, with the cell phone data, I can see whether they went to a restaurant and stayed there for 30 minutes or whether they just made a short visit that looks more like carryout, but I really don't know what informed that decision for them. And I have a hard time getting a lot deeper into the cell phone data than the types of questions I just laid out for you. So I think a survey can be really complementary to that, because if that becomes important, a survey can help us dig into those questions. But the cell phone data is going to be difficult to go much deeper than what is provided by the companies. A second advantage to surveys is that they can combine concepts that appear separately in existing sources. And so what I'm going to show you actually is a prototype survey that combines information from some of our main surveys in the US around labor market participation and overall household income with our main surveys around public health. And right now those surveys mostly exist in two different government agencies actually, and they don't really come together very often. But obviously we're in the midst of a pandemic that has both massive public health implications and massive economic implications, and we might like to be able to start to answer questions that are really at the intersection of those. And so by pulling together these important concepts for the time period that we're in into one source, I think it can help us answer a set of questions that those independent sources can't do. And then finally, and this has been tremendously important to the Institute, it's very important to the Federal Reserve, and it's important in the US in 2020, is to really be very transparent and thoughtful about inclusiveness. And I think a real advantage of surveys is that they allow us to at least say who is in and who is not in terms at least of populations. And if we feel that that's inadequate, surveys, again, provide us a method potentially for trying to improve that. If we want to understand, for example, how respondents are faring on Native American reservations in the United States, we can make an effort to include those populations in our survey. If we want to understand their movements, again, for example, through a cell phone data source, we have very little in the way of methods for expanding that source to cover more people than it already covers. With those types of data sources, you get what companies are collecting, and it's difficult to necessarily expand that into groups that you know are missing. And I would say in many cases, it's even difficult to know who is missing because we don't often have really detailed information about who is in and who is not in that data source. And so I think, again, a great advantage of surveys is that you can say with much more certainty and precision who they represent and who we're actually learning about. And so these are all features that I think are important to consider as part of an overall information gathering response in this current environment. So early on in the pandemic, I issued a proposal that we published as an Institute brief, arguing that the US needed a survey strategy to try to get a handle on the impacts of the pandemic in real time. So I feel that this is early. This is faster than I would have ever worked prior to the pandemic. I think many of you know that the US began shutdowns on March 13th for the most part, so 13 days later. In part with support from our advisory board at the Institute, I had developed a proposal for a large-scale survey that could provide timely and a broad view of the pandemic's extent and impact. And a number of things went into this. But it really led to a proposal that argued that such a survey response should have 4 important features. So the first was that this should be frequent. And in fact, I argued that it should be daily. I also argued that this should be very large. In particular, the goal was to be able to generate in the US county-level statistics and statistics for small demographic populations like our Native American and Indigenous populations. Those tend to be populations where we can't get even sometimes very aggregate national statistics that are reliable. but obviously populations are being impacted in very disparate ways. And so to really understand who the pandemic is impacting, we needed to have a big enough sample, I argued, to get these kinds of granular statistics. And the county level is so important in the United States because a lot of the policy decisions are made at the county level about whether something to open or close or scale back public gatherings. A lot of those decisions get made at the county level and to some extent also for sure at the state level. So I argued that if you wanted to use a survey to inform policymaking around the pandemic, you should really try to gather a sample that was going to be big enough to let you look at those smaller granular populations. I also argued that it should be fairly long lives, and I argued that we should be anticipating an 18 to 24 month period for this survey. That was in March. And then finally, I argued that we wanted to cover multiple dimensions of well-being. Again, along the lines of the example I gave, we have a public health survey in the United States that comes out of one agency, and we have a number of labor market surveys that come out of other agencies. And it seemed really imperative in the pandemic to be able to combine those in useful ways and to survey on a range of dimensions of well-being that we thought at the time were likely to be impacted by the pandemic. So I think in some ways, what inspired this proposal has to some extent been borne out, but in other ways less so. And so I'm going to kind of return to those lessons learned a little bit later in the talk. But this was the initial proposal that I argued would be, I thought, very useful for the United States to engage in. And there was, I would say, in a sense, a social science survey data response. Some of it was a little bit of a response to the proposal we put out, and some of it was a response to just really the exigencies of the moment, and lots of folks were having similar ideas and were concerned about similar needs for policymakers. So if you look out at the landscape, at least in the United States, of survey information and how it has changed in the pandemic, I would argue that what I've outlined here on this slide gives you an idea of, okay, what actually kind of rose up in response to the need for more information around the pandemic. So at the top, I've highlighted the COVID impact survey. That grew directly out of the proposal that I made. It became a Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis and Institute partnership with the Data Foundation, which is a nonpartisan center that does research on federal statistical methods and ways to improve them. And they were able to partner with external funders. So this really represented kind of a Federal Reserve external funders partnership to sponsor a couple of waves of the COVID impact survey. And with that, we were able to cover really in a prototype version. This was not the full version of what was outlined in the proposal, but a prototype version that was able to provide a national estimate. And in addition to that, estimates for 10 states and 8 large metropolitan areas. And we were able to roll that out in the early phase of the pandemic, April and May of this year. The Census Household Pulse Survey is very similar to what I proposed, and I think the proposal, I know, was informative as they sought to develop that. That covers all 50 states in the United States and provides a national estimate as well as state level estimates, and 15 metropolitan areas. And currently there's data available for 2 phases. One April through July, and then a second phase that started in August. And the phase difference is that the questions changed somewhat significantly. There was basically a redesign between those 2 phases. But collection in the Household Pulse survey is ongoing. And then other survey responses. And now I should underscore that all of these are really focused on individuals and households in the United States. So we're thinking of kind of a household survey response here. The Understanding America study is a standing survey panel that is housed at the University of Southern California. They produce national level estimates and then estimates for California. And they have, I would say, some great similarity with what we're doing in the national estimates of the COVID impact survey. And then there's a separate effort at Carnegie Mellon called the Delphi Project, which surveys huge numbers of Facebook users on a daily basis. It's very possible that some of you, actually I would say it's a certainty, that some of you have gotten this survey. I know, I would say 30% of the people I know have gotten this survey, and they ask a brief survey about whether you have COVID symptoms, and they're using that to create a real-time measure of COVID prevalence in the United States. They're also starting to pair that with other types of questions. But so they're drawing that survey effort from a population of Facebook users that then they weight to try to make representative. And then other existing surveys, including the Federal Reserve's own survey of household economic decision-making, the SHED, have added supplements and additions to try to respond to COVID as well. But I think when you try to, again, look out at the landscape and say, what kind of survey data do we have now that we didn't have at the beginning of 2020 that's a direct response to COVID, this kind of summarizes that main social science survey data response. So I want to tell you then a bit about what we've learned, and I'm going to focus. There's a lot that's been learned. I'm going to focus on 3 papers of mine through the Institute and that appear elsewhere that use the COVID impact survey. And then I'm going to talk a bit about kind of the broader lessons learned, I would say, from this overall survey effort. So early in the pandemic, I worked with the COVID impact survey to try to explore the differences in place-based impacts of the pandemic relative to, I call them person-based impacts of the pandemic. And this was really came out of in part that motivation for a survey with geographic specificity. I will be candid that when I looked out from the perspective of March, it seemed very possible that the pandemic was going to have a lot of geographic variation in it, and even within the United States. I think the geographic variation part has been correct, but I think that the actual level of the geography has been quite a bit higher than what I, again, not trained as an epidemiologist, would have anticipated for the US. But I would say in March, really the pandemic still looked like a city-level phenomenon. We had Wuhan, and then we also had the outbreaks in the US, which were city-specific. The outbreaks in Europe at the time in March seemed to mostly be city or kind of what we would call in the United States commuting zone specific. So they spread outside an immediate city, but seemed somewhat localized. And so it seemed possible that we were going to go through an experience where the pandemic moved around with a kind of high level of geographic specificity. And so that was part of the rationale, in addition to the policymaking rationale that I mentioned, for trying to get geographic precision in some of these surveys. So one of the first sets of questions we tackled with the COVID impact survey prototype data was, is there really kind of a place dimension to the variety of impacts that we're seeing in the pandemic? And what you can take away from this graph is actually, to some extent, the interesting story is not place-based. So let me walk you through what these figures are. So in each graph, you see a pre-COVID measure of employment rates. And on the y-axis, you see a COVID era measure of employment rates. So this is comparing the employment rate for a state or a metropolitan area. That's what all of the dots are. It either represents a state or a metro area. Pre-COVID, the employment rate in that area for the demographic group that I'm showing to its COVID era employment rate. And what you see is that with rare exceptions, employment rates in every place measured in the data are to the right of the 45-degree line. And I'm actually showing this using the Census Household Pulse Survey. You see the same picture in the COVID impact survey with fewer dots. And you see the same picture actually even in phase 2 of the Census Household Pulse Survey as we've moved later into the pandemic. It's just the case that in all places in the United States, outcomes have worsened and relative to their pre-pandemic levels. There's no place that has been spared. And there really aren't groups that have been spared, but this is where we start to see more variation. All groups have suffered massive employment declines, But Black workers and Hispanic or Latino workers have suffered greater employment declines, particularly off the base of their pre-pandemic employment levels relative to white workers. So this becomes kind of a first piece of evidence, kind of trying to assess this overall place versus person story in the pandemic. We see, again, big declines across all places and all groups, but when we try to think about where the variation is, it's much more between groups than it is across places. And we see something similar when we look by education group. So again, all the dots in this graph, so every place in the United States, so all 50 states and the 15 metro areas in the census pulse data are to the right of the 45-degree line, meaning that pre-COVID employment levels are higher than COVID-era employment levels. You see a greater shift for workers who have less education relative to those who have more education. And in particular, this is a large change relative to the pre-COVID employment rates, which you can see are considerably higher for those with bachelor's degrees in the United States than those without. So the kind of first question that we tackled in that first paper was just to try to look, is the relevant dimension places or groups? And what we concluded is that there are uneven labor market impacts across groups. This is the biggest kind of dimension of difference in the pandemic, and those uneven labor market impacts are in fact present kind of uniformly across places. So in a second paper, I turned to the question with my co-author, Zach Wozniak, of mental health in the US. So this was a big thrust of a number of survey efforts actually early in the pandemic, was to track mental health and not to focus exclusively on what I would call financial measures of well-being. So our survey advocated for this and included them. The Pulse survey includes regular mental health measures that overlap with ours. The Understanding America study that I mentioned also tracks very similar measures. So lots of really interest in the United States in tracking mental health very carefully. So in this second paper, we really asked, how did mental health change across places and groups in the US in the pandemic? And what I'm showing you with the graph here, and again, since I'm going to cover 3 papers, I'm going to keep this at a pretty high level. This is just one piece from this paper. What you see in this graph is coefficients and standard errors plotted. This one is from the COVID impact survey. You would see a very similar pattern with smaller standard errors if I use the household pulse survey because they have a bigger sample. And these coefficients are relative to that group's pre-pandemic mental health level, measured as an indicator variable for whether you've had any poor mental health experiences in the last 30 days. So that indicator at the top, you can see a very large coefficient on that indicator and very positive. So this indicates that in the COVID era data, poor mental health incidence is much higher than in the pre-COVID era. And in fact, you see that it's increased by about 0.25 percentage points off a base of about 0.4 in the US. So this is an enormous worsening of reported mental health in the United States relative to very comparable questions in a public health survey in the pre-pandemic era. What you then see is kind of going down the graph, relative changes in mental health for different groups in the United States. And I think a number of things stand out here. So the first is that for most groups, that coefficient is not different from 0. And so that's this third bullet point I noted under findings, which is that for most demographic groups, there are gaps in mental health, but they've been preserved in the course of the pandemic. So for example, women report worse mental health than men on average, but you don't see that in the pandemic era, women's mental health has worsened relative to men's. That's what that 0 coefficient on this graph means. Where we have seen some exceptions, where we see relative mental health actually worsening in the pandemic, you see some differences across regions. You also see some differences across Hispanic and non-Hispanic Americans, with mental health worsening for Hispanic Americans relative to others. but the Black-white mental health gap has remained fairly stable in the pandemic. So again, just to emphasize, mental health has worsened for everyone. In many cases, that has preserved gaps in mental health that already existed prior to the pandemic, but we have some cases where relative mental health has changed. And for Hispanic Americans, that is certainly a case where their mental health has worsened relatively. The same is true for higher earning and more educated Americans, have had mental health that has worsened much more relative to lower income Americans. That's striking because these are groups where their employment is largely being preserved. But I think an important part of this, and again, this was part of the rationale for arguing that we should include different measures of well-being. They don't all have to always move in the same direction. And so we're really seeing a clear example here where groups that are faring relatively very well economically in terms of employment and earnings are experiencing very negative mental health shifts relative to the rest of the population. So that, again, was one of our main findings, is that for the most part, mental health gaps have been preserved, but there are exceptions, and they are, to some extent, I think, striking and a bit unexpected. So a second set of findings in this paper really tries to look at COVID, what I would call pandemic impact, pandemic events, and how these impact mental health. So hopefully the numbers in the table are reasonably clear. Let me give you a sense of the magnitudes from the first column. So in this column, again, the dependent variable is the same kind of indicator for did you have poor mental health in the last month. And then on the right-hand side, you see coefficients that are very comparable to the coefficients I showed you in that plot on the previous slide. So for example, if you had income loss in your household since the onset of the pandemic, that increased the likelihood of poor mental health by 0.12, by 12 percentage points. And again, the pre-pandemic mean was 0.4. The pandemic mean is a bit above 0.6, between 0.6 and 0.65. This is a very large increase in poor mental health linked to income loss in the pandemic. And you see another large impact in of kind of food insecurity on negative mental health events. What I'm showing you then across the columns is that the Census survey, which is much larger than the COVID impact survey, gives us similar overall results. And then in the final two columns, we add some covariates that are only available in the COVID impact survey, which asks more broadly about kind of health conditions and health experiences in the household. And what you see there, for example, we're able to add a measure for whether you've had a COVID diagnosis in your home, a measure for whether you've known someone close to you who died of COVID, whether you have your own risk factors for COVID, and we also have a measure of whether you've experienced COVID symptoms in the last 7 days, and also some behavioral measures of how many protective steps you're taking to avoid infection and how many restrictions have been binding on you. And what we take away from those last two columns is a couple of things. First, a COVID diagnosis in the home is very negative for mental health. I don't think that this is surprising, but I think it's important to document how big this impact is. And it's important, I think, for other surveys to start to think about how to fold this in. Because it suggests here that the impact of a COVID diagnosis in the home is as negative as income loss is for folks and food insecurity. A personal death is not associated with as negative a change, but is still about half the size of that coefficient. So that's large and a significant worsening of mental health. And then another factor that comes in as contributing to very poor mental health is having COVID symptoms. So those appear to be very distressing to folks from the coefficient that we have in that column. Interestingly, taking protective steps and experiencing restrictions don't seem to affect reported mental health very much. There's not a strong correlation there. So we take away from this that actual exposure to COVID, concern that you yourself have COVID, those are very negative for folks. But other things like I had to curtail my church going because that was restricted. That doesn't necessarily come in as negative as some of these other pandemic events. So that's a second set of takeaways from that project on mental health. And then a final project uses that symptom data that we have in the COVID impact survey to think about workplace COVID symptom screening. Now this is, it's probably worth providing just a little bit of context about how this is working in the United States. So let me do that. So the US, I think folks probably know this, currently does not have a very robust testing regime. It's much more significant and substantial than it was at the onset of the pandemic. But it's still not very easy for folks who might want to be tested, say, weekly, to go and get that in the United States. And for example, where I am in Minnesota, we are being advised by our healthcare provider that if you don't have symptoms, they don't want to order a test for you. That's going to vary from place to place and provider to provider, but they're doing that because the testing system here is getting close enough to its capacity that they would rather not be testing people who don't have symptoms. So the US does not have an environment right now where you could get a test at will for COVID. If you, for example, were an employer who wanted to have your workers have a physical test every week. So instead, a lot of employers are using basically checklists of symptoms and asking folks, if you have a symptom, please don't come in. So that can show up in different ways. But for example, when I physically want to go into my office, I have to answer a kind of set of questions at the door that are usually on a computer screen, or sometimes there's a health representative there to ask them. They're short, but it's basically a survey of symptoms. And so we have those symptoms in our survey, and so we can actually get a sense of how many folks should be answering these questions in the affirmative, and what does that look like. So that's what we're doing in this kind of final project. And so what I'm showing you here in this graph is really just to try to get a sense from other data sources about how many folks in the US might have COVID symptoms. And so you see the weeks of the Census Pulse survey here across the bottom. That runs from basically week 1 is late April and week 12 is late July. The Household Pulse survey doesn't actually ask about symptoms, but they do ask why you weren't at work. And so what we can do is look at the labor force and say, well, what percentage of folks stayed home saying that they had COVID symptoms? That's a possible response to that question. And you see in that data source that rising over time in the course of the pandemic in the US, and interestingly, also over reopening. So that's the other thing happening over this period. So potentially in the kind of middle part of the Pulse survey, folks wouldn't say that they stayed home sick with COVID symptoms because their employer would be closed. So as we get towards more reopening and the pandemic starts to pick up again at the end of July and in August in the US, we get close to about 2% of the workforce on a kind of weekly basis saying that they were not at work because they had COVID symptoms. And then the higher lines show you folks who said they stayed home sick for other reasons. So absenteeism for sickness reasons is running around like 6 or 7% in the United States. So we want to know a little bit more about how many workers should be screened. Is this the right number? Should 2% be staying home? And also we want to know more about if we do these types of symptom checks, are these equitable? So we can actually answer that with our COVID symptom survey, COVID impact survey, because we ask folks about the symptoms they were experiencing. And an advantage and a caveat to our analysis is that we ask them these symptom questions without any consequences. So of course, someone whose ability to work is contingent on how they answer those questions may answer them differently. It's also a high stakes setting. If you are being asked these questions by your employer, again, you might answer them differently. But we think that our survey is a useful way to gauge what might be happening with these. So what we find is that common symptom checkers in the United States, so these are things that ask you, did you have a headache? They take your temperature. They ask you if you have a cough or you have, tightness in your chest. Basically, there are different constellations that these could have, But overall, if we kind of assess all of them, the kind of upper bound that we get is that these common symptom checkers could screen out up to 7% of US workers per day. We don't know what the kind of weekly window would look like because we don't know a lot about the correlation in those symptoms from day to day. But it basically tells us that employers in the US should be prepared for a fairly large number of workers to be out of work on any given day because they themselves are experiencing symptoms and probably should either seek a test, which will be somewhat time consuming, or they should see how symptoms resolve. So we argue that there's a number of other sources for these kind of high numbers. So a couple of things that we are able to learn from these data. First is that many respondents report any given symptom. So it's not the case that everyone who reports that they are having tightness in their chest also reports a headache. Actually, it's almost kind of remarkable. A fairly steady share of respondents report almost every symptom. So if you screen on 3 symptoms versus 2 symptoms, you are going to pick up different people because the overlap between who reports what symptom is just not that high. So you have really a lot of potential for kind of type 1 versus type 2 error to change across these symptom checkers. The second reason that these symptom checkers could screen out a lot of workers is that the survey design affects their responses, and so it really matters how you ask these questions. And I think we've actually seen employers responding to this a bit over time. I think I've experienced a change in our symptom checker that now I see more symptom checkers asking, have you had an onset of symptoms, as opposed to, do you have a cough? It turns out lots of people have a cough all the time. And so if you ask about that, you will screen out more people than if you say, do you have a new cough that you didn't have a day or two ago? So that design actually really matters. And then finally, demographic groups report symptoms at different rates, even absent differences in COVID exposure. And that's something we're able to study in that paper. Just for an example of this, women report symptoms more than men. It doesn't really matter what the symptom is, they report them at higher rates. And if women are reporting honestly, then we would think this would translate into higher rates of reporting symptoms in an employment setting. But in the US, employment law means that employers have to think very hard about the potential for disparate impact. So a policy, even if it's not intended to screen out one group disproportionately, if it does that, employers may be required to move away from that kind of screen. And so in the COVID context, we're really in a really difficult situation where employers may realize that certain types of workers just answer these questions differently, but it will mean a disparate impact if they continue using them as a screening device. So this is not something that we're able to settle in the paper and necessarily say there should be this set of questions works and this set of questions doesn't. It's really more of a trade-off between that type 1 and type 2 error and who we're going to screen. Are we going to screen in people who are symptomatic because we want to not have as many disparate impacts, or are we going to accept more disparate impact because we want to have a tighter set of screening criteria? So we are, at least I think with that paper, able to lay out some of the relevant concerns for employers. So if I had to take away a bigger picture from the work that we've done with the COVID impact survey, I would take away, I think, these 3 things. The first is that well-being in the US deteriorated markedly and unequally across demographic groups and sectors in the pandemic. And we see this in a variety of measures. Importantly, and I'll come to this in the bottom set of bullets, where we don't see this as an income. So the massive supports through the CARES Act that were allocated by Congress did a lot to bolster US income. And so that is one dimension of well-being that, at least for the time being, has remained fairly stable in the pandemic in the US. A second big takeaway is that the pandemic environment is certainly responsible for this downturn, but not in a way that's very well aligned with virus hotspots or local policy. And again, that was kind of a surprise to me from that vantage point of March 2020. If you anticipated a very local set of outbreaks, you might anticipate then a very local set of lockdowns. And in turn, you might have anticipated a very local set of economic impacts. And in fact, the linkages in the US, and I think all countries are finding this, are just really significant. And so, first of all, it's difficult for the virus to stay very localized, but also the economic linkages mean that the impact economically is not that well aligned with what one state or county is doing relative to its neighbor. Those economic linkages are driving big changes in employment and big sectoral changes, regardless of kind of what the local policy is. So this is really, I'm generalizing quite a bit here, but I do think a bottom line from our research and other research happening over this same time, it's just that the local policies are not that responsible for the economic impacts that localities are seeing. And one thing I always like to highlight with that is that doesn't mean they're not effective at containing the virus. It just means that the linkages in the economy are so substantial that if we're having an economic downturn in one place, it's going to affect other places. It doesn't really say nearly as much as you might think about the successive local shutdown policies at containing the virus. And then a final big takeaway, really from our research and others, and again, generalizing here from really a broad set of studies, is just that a range of well-being indicators suggest a pretty complicated picture. So for example, we're seeing rising food insecurity, not much impact on housing security over the pandemic, and then really fairly stable income. So we're not always getting, and the same is kind of true with the mental health findings that I shared, we're not always getting a kind of perfect alignment between one indicator of well-being and another in the pandemic. So let me then, I think, switch gears to really just the kind of bigger picture of what would I take away from this kind of first era of surveying in the pandemic. So I think, and I'm going to kind of, I would kind of emphasize that I think this slide refers to just the general survey approach in the pandemic in the United States. I think there have been some real wins. I think for the most part, the survey effort that I outlined on that slide of just, what were all the responses from the survey world. Overall, the key topics I think have really been covered. I don't see a lot, and I'll get to an exception, but I don't see a lot where I think we're missing big areas of importance to folks. And I think that's a win. I think that a lot of folks have thought they really need to reach out and survey out pretty broadly. And so we've done a good job with that. There's also a lot of agreement across the COVID era instruments. And, if you really want to dive into the details of surveying, I think this is fascinating. The Census Household Pulse Survey uses a completely different sample frame than the COVID Impact Survey. That's completely different from the Understanding America study. Then there's the Facebook thing. Really, these things maybe should give us very different answers. And the fact that we're getting pretty good agreement across them, I think, is a real victory for surveying, and just tells us that it's possible to do this and we can do it in lots of different ways. And finally, I think that the participation has been reasonable. So I think the response has been very good. Some of what I would put in the losses column, we still do not have good representation of small populations. It is not possible to get very good survey-based statistics for Native American populations in the US. None of these sources that I outlined have county-level statistics, with the exception of the Facebook data. And another set of really losses is that I do think we are missing some important concepts that are just not covered. I do think a win is that for the most part, key topics have been covered in these survey sources, but current health is not widely covered. It was in the COVID Impact Survey, but it's not in any of the other sources, and there's no real prospect right now of including it in a timely way. I think that's a huge oversight to not survey folks on their pandemic exposure in the middle of a pandemic. I just think that needs to be better in survey efforts going forward. We also need better safety net information in the United States. So I didn't get to talk about this, but another set of data sources that folks have turned to have been our administrative data sources. It's very hard to access those in a reliable way in real time. And we need to have a better handle on who is accessing the safety net in the United States and how it's working for them. And surveys are a great way to provide that. We have some of that in some of the sources I mentioned, but it could be a lot better. Also, finally, there's really no sophisticated question rotation or panel. The Census Household Pulse Survey was redesigned, but what you might want to move towards is kind of moving in topics that are relevant for policy but don't need to be surveyed every week or even every other week. There's really no system for that. And then I have kind of a column for draws, things that are kind of a feature and kind of a bug. So one is that different indicators of well-being give different signals. I think this is a feature, but other people have argued that it's a bug, that certain indicators are just better and more accurate. Notably, I think folks have argued that income is that one, and that measures of food insecurity it's just too hard to know what people are reporting. There's variation from survey to survey. Maybe they're not comparable. I continue to see this kind of suite of indicators as really valuable, and I think we have to think hard about why they tell us somewhat different things, but I would call that kind of a draw. I think we're in a place where folks are thinking hard about the value of this. We also just need external pre-COVID benchmarks. We need things that are comparable, and I think we have that to some extent, but we are constantly in this situation of we don't know the counterfactual. We don't know how folks would answer even the same exact survey question if the pandemic were not ongoing. And so this kind of question of is surveying in a pandemic just different from a kind of more standard time period, we're not able to answer that. And that kind of need for a kind of what's the counterfactual COVID survey response is just something that's hard to deal with, and the benchmarks are important for that. And then finally, I would call the geographic granularity a little bit of a draw. Like you saw in some of our work, we don't find necessarily the type of geographic variation and impacts that I might have expected. And so I think it's worth thinking about what's the value of having that granularity, because it's costly. We need a lot more subjects to get it. And finally, continuity, I just think has been reasonably good, but there's no guarantee because we don't currently have a strong federal strategy for this. And so that continuity just becomes an ongoing question. So finally, just how has the survey response from social science informed US policy, and has that been a success? You know, I think the hope, at least that I had, and I think that many others had, was that survey data collected during the pandemic could provide information on behaviors that would help in curtailing the virus. And I thought, and I think others did as well, that having very timely data on need would help target aid better to workers and families that needed it. And I don't honestly think that either of these have really fully come to pass in a real way in the United States. But I do think there's been some ongoing value provided by surveys in that it's these sources that have really kept a broad set of well-being measures under discussion. The fact that we have data on food security, data on mental health, data on how these things are interacting with other types of economic experiences, that has kept those as part of the policy conversation in the United States, at least. And I think that has added value. Those are things that policymakers can consider that they wouldn't have been able to consider without these sources. So even though I don't think that surveys are reaching their full potential in terms of informing policy, I certainly think they've made a contribution in the US. So just quickly, because I want to get to the other great work of my colleagues very briefly, you know, what should folks think about as survey efforts are ongoing? So I think in the US, we've moved to a less frequent administration of these survey efforts, and that has been fine. But remember, in March, it really seemed like we needed daily information. That was where the super steep part of the curve was. Things were changing dramatically day to day. In a sense, I do think daily data was necessary in March. We didn't have it, but it really would have been very helpful. But going forward, going to a kind of every other week survey design, maybe even monthly, that can also be useful. And so I think that a lesson learned here is just the ability to scale that timing would be really helpful. But it may not be the case that you always need daily data to be useful. Second, how should ongoing survey efforts balance immediate policy needs versus long-run research? And this goes back to that, what has the contribution to policy been slide. Right now, there's not a coordinated strategy to look really closely at the survey data and use it to fine-tune policy. And so if we're not using it for that, potentially survey efforts should look a little bit to the longer horizon and think about what are we going to want to know about this in 2, 3, 4, 10 years. I don't think that long-run research should drive all of these efforts. We shouldn't just be in the business of collecting data so that we can write papers for top 5 journals. But there probably is a balance to be struck between informing what policymakers need to know next month versus what we are going to need to really analyze the full impacts of this long term. And then finally, thinking about the value of adding to some of those gap areas that I identified. I think the value is high, but I think any kind of real effort to push surveying into phase 2.0 or 3.0 should really think about what needs to be added. So I just want to briefly mention some of the other work that has come out of the Institute in the pandemic. We've really been able to support a broad range of projects that I think have contributed both to the policy conversation in the US and to what we as researchers know a bit more about the pandemic. Really early on, and I've highlighted our particular scholars in bold here, really early on we provided funding to help a team forecast weekly UI claims using Google Trends data, and they've made that information publicly available. The code and the data and the process is all available on Paul Goldsmith-Pincone's website. It really helped policymakers in the US get a picture of just this unprecedented increase in unemployment and how it was going to evolve. Interestingly, I think again, this number continues to be really of strong interest to policymakers, but having that advance notice, I think it was really valuable in that portion of the pandemic. We've now moved into this phase where if we get new information every other week, that's okay. And I think you really can see that in the way that this work evolved. It just was remarkable how having a good estimate of UI claims even 2 days before it came out on a weekly basis was really valuable at that point in the pandemic. And I think, again, it just really underscores the value of being able to scale the timing and adjust timing on some of these survey sources. So the second project that we supported really looks at the net health and then economic, defined as employment risk for workers by sector, using careful sectoral linkages estimated from basically kind of sector-specific supply chain data. And that was by one of our scholars, Sophie Ashadamahin, and a co-author. They've also written a policy summary of that is more accessible. I know that there's been subsequent work very similar to this, but I think Sophie and her co-author deserve a lot of credit for coming up with estimates of this early on and really identifying that workers in the US who face the greatest health risks also faced the greatest employment risk from COVID-19. We've also had one of our scholars doing a lot of work on the impact of COVID-19 and the environment around it on women's work-life balance and attachment to the labor force. This is coming out in a journal. It's been featured in some policy briefs and in the press as well. We also have 2 newer studies, one on the smartphone data. And if you are interested in really the pluses and minuses of the cell phone data, you can I really recommend consulting this working paper that I think lays out how these data work and then how you can construct an index of mobility, at least in the US, using the available smartphone data that companies have made available. That index is also available on these scholars' websites. And then finally, most recently, a working paper trying to disentangle some of the components contributing to COVID spread in the US. And in particular, isolating the importance of housing crowding relative to urban density, which is they can parse out in their data, and then also the separate role of commuting, particularly among essential workers. And I think this has really contributed to this evolving perception of how COVID-19 spreads. It's certainly there are many reasons why the pandemic outbreak was so severe in New York City, but it turns out that those are not factors that mean it would only be severe in New York City. And I think that was definitely an impression that folks had early in the pandemic, and some of this work I think has really underscored what it was in New York that really contributed to that broad spread early on. And then it's easier to see why those same factors are playing a role now in the spread that we're seeing in the US. So thank you, and I really look forward to having time to take your questions, but I hope you'll check everything out. Full working paper versions available at our Institute website. So I'm happy to take questions if there's some time.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Wozniak. That was an amazing presentation. A lot of information, many papers. I have a couple of questions. I'm going to focus on things that have been working. We ran a survey too around May, and then we ran a similar survey on at the early October. So it's a panel data, and we look for like also mental health issues. And what we found was that women and young people are the most affected group for this pandemic. And also one of the things that was interested in our result is being alone has a huge impact on this variable mental health. We use this instrument that measure depression and anxiety. So I have a couple of questions. So I want to ask you a couple of questions just to give you a preview of why I'm asking these questions. So what type of instrument that you were using for to measure like mental health? You don't have you have a kind of a baseline measure of that because you did some kind of like difference. So also want to know. How do you do this? How do you different? Like it's just an average, or like a, or what? The instrument I think is important to know because again the results that we found are a little different from what you found, even though that there are different countries and stuff like that. We also found like a higher impact on people that has a kind of like worse expectation of income and debt, and we also find that in our paper. And one of the things that I would like to know, if you have studied in your sample, is what happened with people at 65 years old. I'm thinking about Medicare and all this paper about Medicare, and probably those folks have a better insurance, probably. Yes, you have an insurance more than the 64 guys, and therefore they have more instruments to ask for help. I don't know. So have you studied those guys? I think that could be something to look at if Medicare has some impact in reducing these mental health problems. I don't want to ask more questions. I have more questions, but I know that there are other people that want to ask several questions. I'm sorry. Did you hear?
Yeah. So, okay, so there's a lot in there. So let me actually go to my graph because then I'll make sure I say things correctly. So a couple of things. First, so a number of you asked about the instrument. So our questions are drawn from the CESD, and in particular, they were formulated by a group at Johns Hopkins that then circulated a kind of module of mental health questions. And so we drew our mental health questions from there. They're very, coming from the CESD, they parallel questions in other surveys. And in the paper, we discuss in particular the mental health questions in the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance Survey, which is the big population public health survey in the United States. That's what we use as our baseline. It's somewhat imperfect, but I think we argue that it looks like a reasonable comparison, particularly once we convert this CESD set of poor mental health conditions into an indicator for did you experience any poor mental health in the last, in our case, 7 days, then we compare it to a 30-day window in the behavioral risk factor surveillance survey. So we think, if anything, we're getting kind of a modest, we're kind of biasing ourselves down there. But a lot of that detail is in the paper about just kind of why we use that as a comparison, and kind of the exact questions that they ask and that we ask and how they line up. On the kind of substantive findings, a couple of things. We also find it's less apparent in the COVID impact survey, but in the census pulse data that's more precise, we find some impacts for the youngest individuals, and in particular worsening mental health for the youngest individuals relative to older individuals. I think I have that right. That is in the paper. And we also, the kind of question of women, this is a hard one. What we find is somewhat different than what other folks have found. I think it depends a lot on the exact question, and I, again, am generalizing, and I'm probably going out on a limb a little bit. I think the findings for women in the pandemic are somewhat sensitive to the particular indicator we're using. And we see this too in the EPOP rates that we measure look different from the change in the unemployment rates. That's because of underlying differences in part of how women report employment versus unemployment that predate the pandemic. But it means that, again, that disparity of, well, has the pandemic been worse for women or men? It actually kind of depends on if you look at unemployment versus an employment rate. And I think something's a little bit true in the same way with mental health, is that I think it depends a lot on the measure that you're using. So we're trying to be clear about what we use, and I know other folks are, but I think, I'm guessing when we get to the end of this and we look back, we'll see that some of that was really, it was important to think about what measure we were using, particularly for those gender differences. Yeah. Let me know if I didn't answer one of your questions.
I'm interested in Medicare because I'm writing a couple of papers about that.
So we have not done anything on that. There are insurance questions both in the COVID impact survey and in the household pulse survey. And I will say I have not actually seen a study of mental health based on insurance coverage. That would be important to look at. There is some work coming out of the New York Fed that I will promote on basically COVID spread and health insurance access, using variation across the US states in who expanded Medicaid, which gives access to younger and lower income populations. So I have not done that, but yes, I think it's a worthwhile question, and it's possible to do with the sources that folks have. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Someone else? We have time, not a lot of time, but we have.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Wozniak, for your presentation and all the work that you have done. Actually, you mentioned this briefly, but I want to see if you have something else to clarify for us, because the type of survey, how you ask the survey is different, I guess, in the COVID area than the pre-COVID area, in terms of you are doing phone surveys instead of in-person surveys. So there is an issue how comparable are. There is some bias. There is something that, I don't know, might be too difficult, especially when you are comparing with a baseline survey. So do you have a sense of that? Do you of course, you have a sense of if anything looks not so quite right, or how to fix it, or something related to that? I don't know if you have something to help us. actually,
Yeah.
since we are doing that too.
Yeah, so I don't have a silver bullet. I will say, my view is, I think a really valuable instrument in the pandemic has been a standing subject pool, and learning to use those better and expand them more, I think would be really valuable. And they're not something that our statistical agencies currently use in the United States. So the standing subject pool in the Understanding America study that's a kind of privately funded ongoing research survey. The COVID impact survey that I was involved with, we used in part for the national estimates, we used the standing subject pool from the National Opinion Research Center. William Nordhaus at Yale has worked with some folks at the Boston Fed using the YouGov survey, which is another standing subject pool in the United States. The standing subject pools have, I do think, their own challenges, but again, it's a place where you can kind of preserve that whole survey architecture across something as severe as a pandemic. The folks who were in it are still in it, and they were answering the same questions, and now they keep answering them. So I just think, I'm not sure that I was as enamored of them going into the pandemic, but I think seeing the advantages that they offer for this kind of responsiveness, they've really risen in my estimation, I would say. And so I think that's just something for, I think, federal and national statistical agencies to think about investing in. That said, there's a lot to learn here. I think that some of the criticism about the change in methodology has been, I would say, a little aggressive. So I would say there's, for example, there's a working paper that compares food security responses in the pandemic sources to food security responses outside the pandemic sources. My takeaway from that is actually that we have a pre-pandemic source that's very comparable. It's not the one that most folks, including ourselves, have been using. We should switch to using this other source because it's better. And then we get more close. That's not the way the working paper presents it. The working paper kind of presents it as like, you can't compare these two things because people answer things so differently. That's not as much been my experience. I'd be curious what folks who have more experience surveying on mental health think. I just think that the kind of point I was making is, are people more aware of things that they would respond to in a survey? That's possible. The pandemic environment might heighten that. We might be getting, for example, much better information on income than we were getting a year ago, because people have gotten out their checkbooks and really looked at their balances, and they've paid really close attention to their pay stubs. And that can be true even in a source, for example, like our current population survey, which gets asked every month and has an approach, a phone interviewing approach for one part of it that's very comparable between the pandemic and not. There's an in-person part that's less comparable, but they have the exact same question, exact same approach. But I don't know, people might just be paying more attention to their income, and so now they might be answering that question differently. So I think that more substantive point was just, I don't think you can do a lot about that, but it's interesting to think about, and it's something that we'll want to prepare for in other kinds of environments like this, so that people might just answer questions differently because of their pandemic experience, even if you held everything else constant. I didn't give you any help, I'm sorry, but I think
that's perfect.
Yeah.
We are short of time, I think. I don't know if someone else want to ask some question. This survey is public. The data is public available.
Yes. Yep.
Okay, that's good. So we can work on that. Well, I think we are past the time. I would love to ask you more questions. I have more questions about, like, I'm very interested on the mental health issues that you mentioned here. and the puzzles, the geographic location. It is puzzling that there's no big difference between different locations, because there have different ways. There were different ways to handle the pandemic. So I guess that has an impact. But well, thank you so much, Professor Wozniak. That was a very good, very interesting presentation. I'm gonna switch a little bit to Spanish to thank everyone else. Agradecer también a toda la gente que participó en la conferencia, a nuestros partners, que el Centro COES, obviamente a todos los investigadores que presentaron en las 70 mesas que se realizaron entre ayer y hoy, a la gente que nos apoyó de COES y de DESOC, bueno, a todo el mundo, a nuestros speakers, a Sonia Balotra, a Julieta Martínez y a Andrew Foster por también sus muy buenas presentaciones. Aquí terminamos la conferencia. Muchas gracias a todos. Thank you again, Professor Wozniak. That was great. Thank you for being here. I hope in the near future you can visit us in Chile and have a great trip here. Well, thank you, and that's it. Thank you so much to everyone. Yeah, that's it.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.